Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Center. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Susanna Schellenberg. She is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Cognitive Science at Rutgers University, where she also holds a secondary appointment at the Rutgers Center for Cognitive Science. She specializes in epistemology, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of language, and is best known for her work on perceptual experience, evidence, capacities, mental content, and imagination. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that because we're going to focus on her book, The Unity of Perception, Content, Consciousness, Evidence. So, Dr. Schellenberg, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so many times when I have a sort of philosophy of mind interview, I always like to give people a little bit of background because there's usually more than one perspective on whatever kind of mental, neuroscientific or brain phenomena or cognitive phenomena we're talking about. And in this case, starting with perception. So how do philosophers of mind tend to approach perception? I mean, when we talk about perception in philosophy of mind, what are we usually talking about?
Well, it's always hard to generalize over all philosophers, but it's common ground that perception is an event in which we're perceptually related to our environment and to some degree successfully perceive that environment. And beyond that, there is little agreement. Some people, including myself, want to say, in virtue of being perceptually related to the environment, we thereby represent our environment. Others deny that. They want to say perception just is an event in which this relation holds. But what all parties have in common is that perception should be distinguished from cases where things are not in that way successful, such as hallucinations, where we are not related to what it seems to us is present in our environment.
And so, what would you say are some of the most prominent accounts of perception that we can find in philosophy of mind?
Well, these days, very prominent accounts are representationalist views. That's, by far the most, orthodox view in the sense that it's, endorsed by a huge variety of philosophers who agree on who disagree on other issues. That's the basic idea that perception is a matter of representing the things to which we're perceptually related. And then, views differ on what it is we're perceptually related to. But, the standard is that we're related to objects, events, and features in our environment, and that we represent those objects, events, and features. And then, the specific character of what the representational content consists in or what its nature is, people disagree on those details. And alternative views have it that perception is, at its core, a relation to the environment, but that we don't need to think of that relation as entailing a representational mental state. And so that we can think of perception simply in terms of this relation. And I've spent a lot of my career sort of arguing against that view on which perception should be understood in purely relational terms. And other views, that's one sort of big divide, and then there are lots of other sort of ways of thinking about how to carve up the terrain, and a lot of differences can be traced back to what questions are asked about perception. So, perception plays very different roles in our lives. It brings about conscious mental states. It justifies beliefs and brings about perceptual knowledge. So if one's if the question one asks about perception are about its role in justifying beliefs and bringing about perceptual knowledge, the view one will have about perception is going to be quite different than if one's primary goal is to explain how perception can bring about conscious mental states. And the reason is that, hallucinations, illusions, and perception could at least conceivably be subjectively indistinguishable. And if that's the case, then it better be the case that whether or not the relation to the world holds or not, where that relation holds in the case of perception, but doesn't hold in the case of hallucination, matters too much. If perception and hallucination could bring about the very same mental state or the same experience, whereas if the guiding question about one's view of perception is that in some cases perception justifies beliefs or brings about knowledge, namely cases in which one is actually perceiving the environment, and in cases of hallucination, of course, the experience does not bring about mental knowledge, then one is going to want to think of perception and hallucination, at least in part, in quite different ways.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get back into some of the things you mentioned there, like hallucinations and illusions and all of that. But let me just ask you one question about another thing that you mentioned there. So at the beginning of your answer, you talked a little bit about representationalist perspectives. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand it, this representationalism is perhaps the most dominant view, not only in philosophy of mind, but also in the cognitive sciences more generally. Correct.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and usually or sometimes it goes together with computationalist views of the mind, right? In representationalist / computationalist views of the mind / brain.
Right? Yes, that's true. That said, while you mentioned computationalism, it's very hard to have any kind of computationalist view that isn't at its core representational.
Yeah.
But if one moves to connectionist views, which of course in computer science and AI and robotics are dominant, it's less obvious that one wants to have a representationalist view, or what one would mean with representationalist changes quite significantly than on a computationalist account. And that's a way of, a connectionist framework is a way of, it's either a way of thinking about representations in very different ways than you would on a computational framework, or it's a way of thinking about perception as not being representational in very different ways than, the kinds of view that I alluded to before, on which perception is fundamentally a matter of being related to an object, and there's no need to bring in a representational component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course in cognitive science and philosophy we have other alternative, I don't really like to call them alternative because they have, of course, their own merit and very good merit, but we have other accounts, like for example the ones based on complexity theory and dynamic systems theory, and for example embodied cognition, or more broadly 4E cognition, and those are all very, I think, good alternatives to representationalist / computationalist views of the mind, right?
Yes, and something we haven't talked about yet is that one key element of perception, or one thing that makes perception distinctive, is that it's tied to a time and place, right? So we always perceive from a location at a particular time, yeah. And that's one way in which perception differs quite a bit from thought. Of course, we can also think from at a particular time and place, but thoughts are not tied in to the context in the same kind of radical way that perception is, where you can't imagine a perceiver who isn't perceiving in some kind of spatiotemporal dimension. And so that's a way in which, for example, perception not just differs from thought, but also from imagination. So while, when we visually imagine, when we sort of imagine a scene, and the imagination is in any way perception-like, we're going to imagine the scene as if it were from a perspective, but imagination is in no way is not tied to an actual perspective in the way that perception is. And that's a sort of a topic I'm currently working on, which is how to think about the nature of these perspectives. And there is a sense in which, we're always constrained by our perspectives, not just in perception, but also in thought, in that we have certain cognitive tools, certain, perceptual cognitive frameworks, we have certain beliefs, we have emotional temperaments and current emotional states that all affect how we interact, perceive, think about our environment. But at the same time, we can, at least to some extent, transcend that perspective. We're not, we can imagine other perspectives. But thinking about the fact that we always in some way have a perspective entails having a certain kind of humility, both epistemically, in that we don't know exactly what it is like to have a different perspective. Anyway, that's sort of how I'm relating my more recent work that you have read to sort of future interests that I'm currently working on.
Yes. So let me ask you another question about perception, and this is also something that you tackle in your book. So is there an object of perception?
Yeah, so yes. And there are many ways to understand that question. One is just that perception is directed at something, and of course the answer to that is yes, it's directed at something. And some people when they talk about the object of perception, they just mean that perception is directional in that kind of way. And then a second is like, what is the object of perception? And there, the typical answer is, well, it's objects in the world, such as, pens and phones, but it's also features such as the color of the phone, the shape of the phone, and events, namely the fact that I just, put the phone down on my desk. And as I see this, and this is quite standard, all those things can be objects of perception. One way in which my view is somewhat unusual, at least in philosophy, I think less so in other sort of domains where people think about perception, is that I treat features objects on a par more so than is traditional in philosophy, in that features and objects can sort of equally be what we attend to, and that we can, there can be perceptual events where all we do, or cases of perception where all we do is perceive features.
And let me ask you then about this perspective called capacitism. So what is it and how does it tie to perception?
You mean what are capacities, or what is...
basically analyzing or thinking about the mind in terms of capacities.
Yeah. So so if you go back like 100 years, the standard approach was to analyze mental states, the mind, our mental lives in terms of capacities. The specific words people used sort of changed over the decades and centuries. Some people refer to faculties or powers or abilities, competences, but it was standard to analyze the mind in terms of these dispositions, capacities, faculties. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, with Wittgenstein, Frege, and which brought about many benefits in terms of clarity and many other things. And one thing that I think was unfortunate in that linguistic turn is that talk of capacities was replaced with talk of content, mental representation. Now, that wasn't just unfortunate, because that was one reason why we started analyzing the mind in much more specific and precise ways, because when we talk about mental content, we can, discriminate and distinguish much more clearly what the different elements are of mental states. And one thing I do is to say that we don't need to choose between analyzing the mind in terms of mental representations or mental capacities. In fact, we can do both. And in fact, I want to say that we should think of mental representations in terms of employing perceptual capacities. So employing perceptual capacities, as I see it, constitutes representational content. And so they're just sort of the flip side of the same. And now you might ask, well, if you have mental representation, why hold on to the capacities? And the reason for that is that they allow for many good things. One is that they allow for an elegant counterfactual analysis of mental states. So we can think of mental states in terms of the function they have. So mental capacities have a certain function. The perceptual capacities, as I see it, function to discriminate and single out particulars in the environment. And then we can think of the employment of capacities irrespective of the environment in which we employ them. And as I see it, when we hallucinate, suffer an illusion, or perceive, let's say, to stick to the same example before, a blue phone case or a blue phone, we employ the very same perceptual capacities. And so in that sense, those three states, the hallucination, the illusion, and the perception, have something in common. They're all a matter of employing the very same perceptual capacities. But they differ in that in the perception case, we're actually related to a blue phone, whereas in the hallucination case, we are not related to a blue phone. It just seems to us as if a blue phone is different. And in that case, that's spelled out in terms of the capacities. The idea was that in the perception case, we employ the capacity to discriminate, blue, and discriminate a shape, and discriminate, the phone. And in doing so, successfully single out the phone. In the hallucination case, we employ the very same capacity, but fail to thereby discriminate and single out the phone. And the illusion case is sort of a mixed case in between.
So, in that case, if we take the capacitist view, let's say, and to try to understand perception, hallucination, and illusion, what exactly, in what ways would context matter? In terms of employing mental capacities irrespective of the context or in particular contexts?
Right. In a sense, there's always a particular context, right? Because we always employ the capacities at a time and space, and in that sense, there's a context. But we can think of, the case of, I'll just stick to hallucination, the case of hallucination and perception, in terms of what the two cases have in common. And so in terms of how they are similar, irrespective of the contextual fact that in the one case, namely the hallucination case, we're not related to the blue phone, whereas in the perceptual case, we are related. And so in that sense, I want to say there's there's a substantial common factor between the perception case and the hallucination case. But there's also a difference in that in the one case, there's a difference that everyone agrees to, which is that in the one case, we're related to the phone, in the other case, we're not. And then I want to say that difference manifests itself in that in the one case, we employ capacities such that they fulfill their function, namely to discriminate and single out the blue phone. And in the other case, we employ the capacities, baselessly. We employ the capacity without them fulfilling their function. Put in terms of concepts, the idea is, not is might be more familiar we can see, we can think about a horse without a horse being present. In that case, we employ the concept horse without thereby referring to an actual horse, or we can employ the concept horse while thinking about an actual horse that's present.
Mm-hmm. But when we're just thinking about, let's say, a general horse without really seeing an actual horse, do you think it's correct to say that we are employing the capacities irrespective of a particular context, or not?
No, of course not. I mean, so the two cases are not completely analogous, right? Okay. I mean, if you think about horses in general, you're in a very different mental state than if you're thinking about a particular horse, right? Mm-hmm. It's and I've here, as is common in philosophy of perception, been always working with the assumption that a perception and hallucination could be subjectively indistinguishable. That is, from one's first-person perspective, they seem exactly alike. I live in New York City, so there's a lot of street noise here. I hope it's not too bothersome. But with now, to have a thought, an analogy in the case of thought that's more similar to the perception case, it would be the case where one, refers to a horse and aims to refer to a horse but fails to do so. And that would be cases where in the one case you have a singular thought, and in the other case it seems to you that you have a singular thought, but you're not in fact successfully referring to a particular horse. That would be sort of a more clear analogy case to the perception case at the level of thought.
Mm-hmm. So tell us then about the particularity thesis. What is it?
So I argue that one of the many very important features about perception is that it's characterized by particularity, which, that idea is not at all novel to me. It's, generally assumed, which is the idea that when we perceive, this blue phone, we are perception related to a particular blue phone, one specific blue phone. Mm-hmm. That's important, but also that it seems to us that a particular blue phone is present. And there are many, and one thing I do in the book is tease apart many different aspects of those claims. So one aspect is that when we perceive, it seems to us that particulars are present. And when we hallucinate, at least when we hallucinate in a way that subjectively seems like a perception, it also seems to us as if particulars are present. And I call that, property of our consciousness phenomenal particularity. And I distinguish that idea, which is an idea at the level of perceptual consciousness, from a related but very different idea, which I call relational particularity, which is the idea that when we perceive, the particular phone, our mental state is at least in part different than it would be if if no phone were present, or if a numerically distinct but qualitatively identical phone is present. And that's important because perception plays, as I mentioned at the outset, the role of bringing us, providing us with knowledge of our environment. And, it's not the case that when I see the phone, I have knowledge that some phone is present. I have knowledge about this particular phone. And if you plug in more interesting cases than phones, then, this becomes more salient. I don't reach out for, some cup or other. I reach out for this particular cup present. And, if you bring in people like it matters that the person I love is this particular person rather than some qualitatively identical, numerically distinct person. And so the idea is that, if you take seriously the idea that perception provides us with perceptual knowledge, it better be the case that your mental state is in some way characterized by not just phenomenal particularity, but also relational particularity, namely a representation that tracks the particular object or feature or event that you perceive. I'm sort of focusing here on objects because they are easiest to sort of bring home what's at stake.
But this perceptual knowledge, I mean, how can we be sure that we really do have access to this perceptual knowledge? I mean, epistemologically speaking, how do we approach this issue?
Yeah, I mean, you can always be a skeptic. You can always question whether you really know that it's, this cup or this, phone rather than someone else's phone. So there's always room for questions and skepticism. But, to the extent, like everyone agrees, I'm sure there's someone out there who disagrees, but almost everyone agrees that we can gain knowledge about our environment. And one critical way that we can do that is via, and of course, there are many other ways we can gain knowledge, but perception is at least one very good way to gain knowledge. And so, and it's hard to explain that fact, possibly impossible to explain that fact, if one doesn't acknowledge that one represents, the particular objects that one perceives, rather than just the fact that there's some object or other there. And that's kind of that's sort of, you asked about my particularity thesis, that's sort of one of the key ideas behind it and motivating it. I mean, another way of putting it is not so much in terms of knowledge, but in terms of the fact that we demonstratively refer to things. So we can say, I can say, oh, that's my glass, which is always important in complex dinner situations, and that refers to the particular glass I'm pointing to or I'm seeing, and in doing so, you can track which glass I'm talking about. The idea of the particularity thesis spells out the details of that. Yeah.
So, and in your particularity thesis, do you try to tie together the epistemological, the phenomenological, and the cognitive roles of perception? And if so, how do you go about it?
Yes. So I want to, I earlier on in our conversation refer to at least two, key questions that motivate perceptual accounts about perception. One, sort of a knowledge justification question, an epistemological question, and a second, sort of a consciousness question. How does, the first questions would be, how does perception justify knowledge? How does it justify beliefs? How does it bring about knowledge? The second set of questions was, how does it bring about conscious mental states? And then a third question or set of questions would be, how does the perceptual system accomplish the feat of converting variant retinal inputs into representations of invariant features in the environment? And yet another that you appeal to would be, what is the relation between perceptions and beliefs? Mm-hmm. And a lot of accounts of perception tend to focus, for good reasons, on one or the other of these questions. And, lots of differences between views can be traced back to which one of these questions are focused on. And one of my, leading motivations in writing the book, my book, The Unity of Perception, is to do equal justice to these different questions and provide an account that equally explains how perception can bring about conscious mental states, how it can justify beliefs, and how it can yield knowledge, and so forth. And the key idea that you alluded to is that perception is fundamentally a matter of employing perceptual capacities, and these perceptual capacities generate a mental state with perceptual consciousness. In fact, I want to say employing perceptual capacities constitutes perceptual consciousness. And since in perception and hallucination and illusion, at least ones that are qualitatively identical, we employ the very same perceptual capacities, those have the very same, can have the very same perceptual consciousness. But since in some cases we, in the hallucination case, we employ the capacities without singling out a particular, whereas in the perception case, we employ the capacity while successfully singling out the particular, the representational content yielded by employing those capacities, it is at least in some respect different. Namely, in the hallucination case, we have some representational content, but it's sort of defective, where the defectiveness tracks the failure to discriminate and single out a particular, whereas in the perception case, we the perceptual content is characterized by what I just called relational particularity. So it tracks, it represents the particular object present, and in virtue of that, perceiving the particular provides perceptual knowledge of the particular perceived, whereas in the hallucination case, perceiving the employing the capacities does not provide such knowledge because one isn't perceiving a particular. So the details are more complicated, but that's sort of the idea in a nutshell.
So let's get a little bit more into consciousness, because we haven't really talked much about it. So in terms of the relation between perception and consciousness, there are many different approaches in philosophy of mind. You address some of them in the book, like, for example, sense data and qualia theories, relationalist views, and sensory awareness of abstract entities, for example. So, when it comes to these more, let's call them traditional views in philosophy of mind, what would you say are some of the places where perhaps they fail, or you think they fail?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There's sort of an old principle in philosophy, which is motivated by how things are in perception. In perception, we're related to something, and we're aware of that thing, and in virtue of that, we are in a perceptual state with phenomenal consciousness. Mm-hmm. Now, if you translate that story to the case of hallucination, the idea becomes that that one has to be aware of something which then explains your state of phenomenal consciousness. Now, because in hallucination, you're not related to, any object in the world, at least in the sort of radical case, the move then is to plug in something that you're aware of that then explains your state of phenomenal consciousness. And what that thing is that you're aware of has, changed dramatically over the centuries. So, there are views that what one is aware of is some kind of sense data. That was a view that was popular at the beginning of the 20th century. Others have argued that what one is aware of are qualia, which are some kind of peculiar entities that constitute perceptual consciousness. More recently, people have argued what one is aware of are phenomenal properties. And then the idea is that there's strong push to have a unified account of perception and hallucination. And the idea then is that if that's what one is aware of in hallucination, the idea is then that one is aware of the same thing in perception. And I think that whole approach is misguided. So I think one should not plug in anything that one is aware of in hallucination. And one needn't plug in anything that one isn't aware of to explain perceptual consciousness. And so this might be sort of the most radical aspect of my book. I kind of reject this whole approach of analyzing perceptual consciousness in terms of an awareness relation to something, whatever that thing might be. I mentioned, traditionally that those things have been referred to as sense data, as qualia, and a more common view these days is to refer to them as properties of some sort. And my alternative approach is to analyze perceptual consciousness or consciousness more generally in terms of a mental activity, namely the mental activity of employing perceptual capacities.
So, with the approach you present in the book, would one of its aims be also to try to understand how consciousness is brought about from, or how it results from mental activity?
Yes, that is the idea. Yeah.
And so, but does that tie in any way with the so-called hard problem of consciousness?
Yes, my goal in the book is not primarily to explain consciousness, and I devote one chapter to the topic. My goal is to give a unified account of the different roles that perception plays in our lives, and I'm not in the business here, at least, of analyzing the hard problem of perception of consciousness, but I do think that we should shift the focus from trying to explain consciousness in terms of awareness relation to something else. And of course, there's lots of ideas out there about consciousness which relate to that, and I specify this idea of shifting the focus to shifting it to a kind of activity, mental activity, and very specific mental activity, namely the mental activity of employing capacities, a kind of mental tool. Yeah.
Yes, because I was really trying to understand if, the kind of issues you're trying to tackle in the book are related just to the relationship that perception has with, for example, consciousness or some other aspects of our mental lives that we've already explored here, or if by doing so, by looking at that relationship, you would also be aiming at perhaps trying to understand what those mental aspects, like, for example, consciousness, are, if you're trying to aiming at, also at understanding what their nature is, let's say.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. One has to make choices in life, and one can't do everything in one book. And the book is focused on perception, but I think every aspect of the view can be generalized beyond perception. So to give you an example, if I come to it, I want to argue that we can think of imagination, at least visual imagination or imagistic imagination, as employing the very same capacities we employ in perception. And in that sense, that would make imaginations very much like hallucinations. The big difference being that, at least in the standard case of imagination, you voluntarily or intentionally bring about the mental state. And in that sense, they're very different from hallucinations where, at least in the traditional case, it seems to you as if you're perceiving. In imagination, the standard is not that it seems to you that you're perceiving. You're imagining, let's say, a blue phone, to stick to this somewhat stupid example that I picked at the beginning. And I want to say that, if your imagination is somewhat perception-like, you will possibly be employing the very same capacities that you would employ when you're in fact perceiving the phone. It won't seem to you as if you're perceiving the phone because you're intentionally employing those capacities. But that kind of view, for example, allows for an elegant way to explain cases of what's called imaginative immersion, where one kind of ceases to realize one is imagining. Cases that are very typical for children who kind of get immersed imagination, and where their imaginations can become more or less hallucination-like, and in pathological cases it can start to resemble delusions. And so, imaginations in your standard case are intentional and highly cognitive, and in more complicated cases, it can become more or less like hallucinations. And this kind of view, which I haven't written out, but I've sort of presented in talks, just kind of expands this view to imaginations. Or to take a different example, like the view in epistemology that I develop is entirely focused on perception, but I very much want to expand that view to cases of knowledge that are not perceptual knowledge, where the relevant capacities wouldn't be perceptual capacities. The relevant capacities employed that bring about the state of knowledge wouldn't be perceptual capacities, but inferential capacities or other capacities. And so the details would change quite dramatically, because the rules that govern perceptual capacities are very different from the rules that govern inferential capacities. But the general framework of thinking about the mental states in terms of capacities would be the same.
But when it comes to this perceptual knowledge, I mean, it is knowledge about what exactly? And I'm going to be more specific with that question. So, for example, just to get into a specific example, there are, I guess, certain properties of the stuff, wherever it is that is out there and that we supposedly perceive, like, for example, a color, let's say.
Right.
I mean, physically speaking, many people would argue that color not really exists, that it's something that is a construct of our perceptual systems. I mean, it's not an intrinsic property of a particular object. It's something that by our retinas being hit by particular photons with particular frequencies or whatever, that they produce eventually in our cortices, they produce a particular color like red, green, blue, whatever. I mean, if that's the case, when it comes to perceptual knowledge, what is that knowledge really about? Because is it really about something that is out there, or is it more of a, let's say, constructivist knowledge, in the sense that our minds are also participating? There's sort of a feedback between the environment and the mind.
Yeah, those are excellent questions, and you're, of course, absolutely right. And I 100% agree. And how does this idea about capacities relate to that? So I've sort of been generally just talking about very simple cases of employing perceptual capacities, but yes, sort of at the neurological level, there is complex feedback relations in the process of which mental representations get constructed. And after having written my book, I had this fellowship that allowed me to spend 2 years to basically study neuroscience, which was really really wonderful. And And when I've been talking about perceptual capacities, I mean sort of person level perceptual capacities. The underbelly of all that is far more complicated, and how exactly those perceptual capacities relate to their neural underpinnings is, a deeply complex phenomenon. But, more specifically to your question about what is the thing we know in the environment, that's of course complex. Now, as is standard these days in philosophy, perhaps falsely, but I think I think it's a correct way to think about it. I'm very much a realist in that I think features, shapes, objects exist in our environment and we perceive them. Now, you're right, of course, it's not as if they're color patches out in the environment, but there's something that you and I both are, there's something physical that you and I, when we perceive this, to be blue, assuming you're not colorblind, that we are both related to, which is, actually, forget the colorblind comment, that you would be related to even if you were colorblind, which is a wavelength reflectance properties. If you're colorblind, then the way you see it would be quite different from the way I see it due to, different receptors, or differences in our receptors. But the point is that, with sounds, colors, all these properties that traditionally have been called secondary qualities, there is a physical thing out in the world that gives rise to whatever it is we come to perceive. And that's all I need for my purposes. And what we gain knowledge about is that thing in the world, which we then call blue, even though what is in the world doesn't precisely match the blueness that we experience. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, because these are, at least as far as I'm concerned, very interesting questions, intellectually speaking, because they open an entire realm of questions that are at the same time epistemological but also ontological, because I mean, in terms of the epistemology of it, it's questions regarding, okay, so this is knowledge about what exactly? Where does this knowledge come from? Is it really about literally what is out there to be perceived, or is it sort of constructed, or perhaps you also can get into some, I don't know, more pragmatist views of knowledge, perhaps more from an evolutionary perspective in terms of, so this is more pragmatic knowledge. Okay, so our brains evolved in a way to perceive things with particular features that are pragmatically, let's say, useful for us to move around in the world and reproduce and all of that kind of thing. But also, I mean, in terms of the ontology, can we say that color exists, that surfaces exist, and I mean, all of the different kinds of physical features that we supposedly perceive? I mean, if it's really something that is actually out there and we can say has some sort of existence that is independent of the way our brains construct it or them, or not.
Right. And I definitely want to say, and this is the standard view throughout philosophy, at least currently, that the properties, features, objects, events exist out there. Now, do they exist in the precise way that we experience them?
No.
Not always, of course, right? So those are two different things. But there's definitely a physical, tangible basis to the things we represent. Yeah. Now, you brought up a different issue or related issue, which is very interesting, and which is something I'm currently working on more directly, which goes back to work of mine from quite a while ago that didn't make it into this book because you have to make choices. But like when we see this this round shape here and it's moving, we perceive it to be, at least if we're like most humans, we perceive it to be consistently round, even though what impinges on the retina changes as we move it. Right. And so, and that's something that's very much connected to the perspectival nature of perception, that we perceive things to be constant, or features, objects who have constant features, even though what impinges on the retina, to stick to vision, is constantly varying. And that's due because, at least us humans, are very interested in what's stable in our environment rather than what's fleeting and changing. So just to stick to shapes, because they're sort of the easiest case, we what we are, in some sense, what directly impinges on our retina is a perspectival property, yet what is primary in our perceptual consciousness is a non-perspectival property. And that's because of our interest. We're interested in how things are independent of our perspective, even though we always have a perspective on them. And you can easily imagine a perceptual system that is much less geared towards perceiving or being aware of constant stable properties than ours is. And there's reason to think that other animals aren't as focused on constancy or stable properties, the properties that are perspectival independent, as we are.
So we've already touched a little bit on thought, but let's get more into that. So how do you look at the relationship between perception and thought?
Yeah, well, there are many differences, of course, and the difference between perception and thought is quite hotly debated. Yeah. And I'm one of the people who think there's a recent book that I think I might have here, although I can't see it right now, by Louise Pessoa, which...
the entangled brain.
Yes, exactly, yeah. You're very on top of things. I'm impressed. That argues against these sort of divides in the mind and brain. I mean, he's focused on the brain. He's a neuroscientist, and it's excellently argued. It's extremely convincing.
Yeah. I'm going to interview him later this year. But yeah, in the book, I think he makes a case for not really being a strict divide in the brain and, cognitively speaking, between emotion, cognition, perception, and all of
precisely.
those.
Yeah, precisely. And he, has, very detailed empirical studies at how things are so intertwined at a physical level that, of course, we can all agree there are clear cases of perception and clear cases of emotion and clear cases of cognition. No one needs to deny that, and he, of course, agrees with that. But to the extent that these, I'll say, capacities are just intertwined at so many levels, even if we can recognize, clear standard cases, it's not obvious that we're going to learn more about perception than trying to focus on how to think about the divide. So it seems like it might be a better approach. And now I'm sort of going beyond what Louise Pessoa says, to just focus on, understanding the key functions or the key nature of perception rather than on how to think about the divide. Now, this kind of went off on a bit of a tangent. But I just wanted to say that, generally speaking, I haven't focused in developing my view on perception on how it differs thought. But of course, it differs from thought in many ways. So one is that, which I mentioned earlier, is that perception is tied to a perspective in a way that thought isn't as categorically. Like perception is perspectival all the way down in a way that thought isn't. And think about objects without those objects being present. We can't perceive objects without the objects being present. That's a very flat-footed, clear case in which they distinguish. Now, at the level of processing, though, I want to say that the capacities employed in perception can be more or less like cognitive. So they can be more or less cognitively infused. So, to give you a specific example, when a child, acquires the concept, say, square, it typically if it's like most children, it acquires it via perception, by being shown square things and being shown round things, and then it realizes, the square things are similar in this way, and it learns to employ the concept square to refer to square things and not to refer to round things. And let's say the child becomes a mathematician, its concept of square is going to become much richer, and its capacity to discriminate square perhaps changes in virtue of having all this mathematical knowledge. And where you say that the perceptual capacity stops and the cognitive capacity of square starts, I think is going to be very fuzzy, So what this leads to is to say that like expert perception and novice perception. I mean, to stick to this example, you can think of the child as being the novice perceiver and the mathematician as being the expert perceiver when it comes to squares. Chances are it's different. I mean, this is not the best example. Like, here's maybe a better example. I'm not an architect, obviously. If I see a building, I see windows and a facade and doors. Now, if an architect sees a window, she sees many more features than I do, but she also sees the very same features in more complex ways than I do. She sees structural elements, she sees texture, she sees things that I don't have. I mean, the way I put it, I don't have the discriminatory capacities to see those things. I don't have the perceptual capacities to see those things. Or to take an example that I think most people have experienced, let's say you see, you hear a style of music for the first time. The typical experience is that one doesn't hear that much, and let's say one doesn't, to stick to things, to keep thought out of it just for a second. Let's say one doesn't learn any technical, theoretical knowledge, but one just listens to that style of music for a month. What typically happens is that when one hears the same recording as one did a month ago after having listened to that style of music for a month, is that one hears more. And the way I would explain that is that over that course of that month, one's discriminatory capacities became more fine-grained, and one is now able to discriminate between, let's say, the saxophone and the piano and whatnot. And now if one acquires theoretical knowledge about that style of music, one probably will also hear more, but one also will hear differently, and one will perhaps recognize things that one was not capable of recognizing before one had that theoretical knowledge. And now, at some point, if one has sort of cognition up here and perception down here, one is no longer just perceiving, or one is basically just thinking about the music. And where exactly perception stops and thought starts, there are many ways to think about that, but a lot of them are incredibly terminological laden, so one key ways to make the distinction between perception and thought is just via processing time, and obviously that's something where, at some point someone decided if it's this fast, it must be perception. If it's not fast enough, it can't be perception. While it's always interesting. I'm interested in all aspects of perception to know where these divides are. I'm not sure that focusing on delineating things is the most successful approach to learn more about perception. And to tie this back to the beginning, for reasons that are beautifully spelled out in this book by Luis Pessoa.
Yeah, but perhaps conceptually speaking, having some sort of distinction between those different mental phenomena is still useful, but really when it comes to understanding how they relate to each other, I mean, neuroscientifically speaking and cognitively speaking, at least if Dr. Pessoa is correct in the case he makes, and it is, in fact, I think, a very compelling case, then perhaps it's not that scientifically rigorous to talk about things that way, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. Right. So I absolutely do not want to say, oh, we should not distinguish between emotions, perceptions, and thoughts, right? No one wants to, there's clear cases of anger that have nothing to do with thought and clear cases of anger that have nothing to do with perception, right? Yeah. And so, right, so we don't want to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater. The question is really whether the focus as, theoreticians or, empirical researchers should be on delineating the boundaries and what can be gained from that. This is a bit of an unfair analogy, but there's a fuzzy boundary between red and yellow. But it's obviously not very helpful to specify exactly where we should draw the boundary between red and yellow to understand either red or yellow better. We should look at red and look at yellow and understand what red and yellow is, and spending all our time trying to delineate where exactly to draw the boundary is not going to help us understand either yellow or red better. Obviously, this analogy to perception, cognition, and perception emotion breaks down really quickly, but at least, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned some things there that for me are also very interesting, like, for example, as children grow older and as they acquire new concepts and perhaps tweak a little bit the way they perceive things, and also if they get, let's say, some formal training in particular areas like mathematics, geometry, or a very interesting case that I experienced personally. I mean, when I was in university, I studied dentistry, and at a certain point, we had sort of a coding scheme for the different. It was not really different colors, but different shades, hues, and all of that kind of thing, of yellow or whitish to yellowish for the teeth, the different colors there. And I mean, one thing that really struck me was that after I was taught that, I started seeing that more easily, and I mean, and then when that transition occurred, and now, I mean, whenever I look at people's teeth, I can't avoid not seeing those differences in terms of color and all of that. I mean, but one thing that really struck me was that, and also because I'm interested in these philosophical questions, is so, I mean, what really happened there? I mean, is it that I'm seeing reality more clearly now just because I got that training? Is that really what it means? Or is it that I'm perceiving a different sort of reality? Is it that I'm perceiving more colors? I mean, what does it really mean? But I mean, it's really fascinating to also look at the power that sometimes culture and learning and professional training can have on the way we perceive the world, or at least some specific aspects of the world. Right.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I think, there's many different cases. And there are cases where I would say one just acquires more fine-grained capacities. The example of listening to a style of music without learning anything about it intellectually would be a
Yeah.
case like that, where it's purely perceptual.
Mm-hmm.
There are cases where one's existing capacities get transformed or enriched in some way.
Yeah.
When a child learns, the concept square, or acquires the perceptual capacity to discriminate square from other shapes,
Mm-hmm.
that you can grasp that capacity more or less well, and depending on how you think about capacities, you grasp the capacity more or less well, or your actual capacity develops. And then there are phenomena which, what you were talking about, if I understood it correctly, seems to be one of those, where one acquires a completely new concept, typically, sort of a top-down cognitive concept, and that allows one to see things that one didn't see before. Speech perception is very interesting, a phenomenon where, clearly the divide between thought and perception becomes so intertwined that it's very hard to draw a line between what's perceptual and what's cognitive.
Yeah.
And when there's studies showing that when one learns to read, when a child learns to read, they hear speech differently, which is not surprising. Like, the abilities to categorize become different. And so whenever you have these developments in, as I would put it, one's conceptual, one's capacities, one's mental tools, that will affect that will affect one's perspective on the world, what one can see, what one can think about, and will also affect one's phenomenal states.
Yeah, but I mean, this is really fascinating because it makes you think. So, I mean, if I see more shades of yellow or white than the regular person out there, does that mean that it was out there to be perceived, and then after I got the training, I'm able to perceive it? Or is it that the fact that I got these cognitive, that I acquired this new cognitive tool, let's say, that my mind now allows me to construct that
Oh, I see.
added aspect to perception that perhaps many people do not have, you know?
Right. I mean, in that kind of case, firmly side, and I might have not fully gotten the example that you gave in dentistry, the thing you learned. So maybe I'm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit complicated because there are really, I mean, I'm saying there are, or at least I've learned that there are different shades of white and yellow, and I
Oh,
mean,
I see. I see. Yeah. I mean,
with training, you are able to really immediately
see those
distinguish
differences.
between them.
Right. I mean, I mean, this is one thing where I have like strong intuitions about, but I would say, no, the reality stays the same. I mean, take the case of, listening to the same tune, on May 1st, and then listening to again that May 30th, and throughout the month you listen to that style of music. The recording is actually exactly the same, and let's say, the acoustic situation is identical, or as identical as possible. So the auditory input is the same. What's changed is your ability to process that auditory input. And, one way of saying what that means is that you've acquired more fine-grained capacities, or you categorize differently. Wine tasters, for example, apparently when they learn to categorize, they can go through a phase where they taste less. So I'll take a different example. Like, when one learns a language, one obviously categorizes more, and phonetically speaking, one can become a little bit rigid for a while, which has the effect that if one is talking in a foreign language, there's sort of a phase where one has quite a lot of trouble understanding accents, which one then, as one learns the language better, becomes much more flexible about, because one expects, like A's or whatever to sound a very specific way.
Yeah, and one very interesting thing about that is that, at least this is my personal experience, when you don't really understand what people are saying because you haven't learned the language at the beginning, you can't really distinguish between the different words. I mean, it just seems like continuous, no spaces between words, but as you acquire more vocabulary, oh, okay, so that's one word, that's another word, you become really parsing the, let's say, the speech out.
Yeah, no, precisely. Yeah, and I'm obviously biased, but sort of the beauty about thinking about mental states in terms of capacities, it allows one to say, for example, that let's say you and I, let's say you're an architect and we see a building, we're perceptually related to the very same thing, but due to your more sophisticated, more fine-grained capacities, but also more categorical abilities to perceive, you just simply see more. I mean, even though we're perceptually related to the very same thing. So, that's kind of an idea that I think any reasonable account of perception needs to sort of accept, that, there's an abundance of data or information out there to perceive. And in your typical case, you don't perceive everything, you perceive what you notice. But also, and this is the more interesting aspect, the very same feature in the environment can be represented in different ways. And the way I would put that is, the very same feature in the environment can be singled out with a range of different capacities that are more or less fine-grained. So, I mean, here's a sort of an example. Let's say there's a field of flowers, red and yellow, and obviously there's a lot of green too because of the leaves. If I'm not paying attention, I will just notice that there's red and yellow and green there. If I'm more if I'm paying more attention, I will discriminate much more finely between the different colors out there, between the different shades of red and yellow.
Yeah.
But in both cases, I represent the very same features. I just represent them by using more fine-grained tunes and capacities. And if I'm a painter, let's say, presumably I will have a much more sophisticated or more fine-grained color capacities. Or if I'm a dentist, I will have more fine-grained white. I will discriminate between different shades of white in a much more fine-grained way, and thereby come to represent the environment in a much more fine-grained way. But we represent the same environment.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some. I mean, of course, if we put it in those terms, if cognition is at the top and perception at the bottom, there's definitely more top-down input if you acquire, those, I'm calling them cognitive tools. I mean, if you learn to be an architect or a dentist or whatever, I mean, there's definitely more input that comes from you acquiring those cognitive tools into what you perceive.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
No, I mean, these are really fascinating questions, but very complicated, I guess. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, the book I'm currently writing on, I'm currently writing a book on perspectives and these sort of differences between, expert perceivers and novice perceivers. And then, there are many different ways of being expert perceivers, plays at least some part of it, part in the book. And, there's also the phenomenon of one learns a concept. I can't think of a good example right now. And then one sees, think of a sort of social justice phenomenon. One suddenly sees the phenomenon And of course, the phenomenon existed all along, but by having the concept, one is much more able to point it out and think about it, even though presumably the reality didn't change that much between acquiring the concept and not having had it previously.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because earlier I mentioned briefly, or I touched briefly on culture, but we've been giving here mostly examples that come from expert knowledge, but also perhaps looking cross-culturally, there would certainly be, and we know that there are from cultural psychology, for example, perception or effects on perception that are culturally based. That is, I mean, even if it's not expert knowledge, just by being enculturated into a different culture, there are certainly things that you perceive differently.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Or things one notices. And yeah, yeah. No, I mean, basically, I think, we all have somewhat different capacities just due to the differences in our lives. Like we
Yeah.
acquire capacities, mental capacities, perceptual capacities, cognitive capacities
Yeah.
by interacting with the world. Some are probably innate. Some are very easy to acquire just in virtue of just interacting with the environment. And our environments are somewhat different, but also, if one, grows up on a farm, one will become very sensitive to certain things that one, there's no reason to become sensitive to if one grows up in a city, and vice versa. And so, there's always social, cultural, contextual reasons to acquire some capacities than others. And but what's important for me is that while there are all those differences, we all perceive the same environment, at least if we are in the same space. So there is that there's no sort of relativist consequences of the fact that we all have these different perspectives. It just means that the same environment can be represented in quite different ways, but it is the same environment that's being represented.
So, I mean, it wouldn't have any, let's say, ontological consequences, right? I mean, the fact that perhaps we are cognitively or to some extent epistemologically equipped in different ways wouldn't have consequences for the sort of ontology we're talking about here.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, certainly. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me ask you a little bit more just about one more topic. I mean, we've already touched on it a little bit here, but just one more question about how capacitism, I mean, the sort of implications that capacitism would have for how we understand evidence and knowledge. Because, for
Yeah.
example, in the book, you tackle some competing views like knowledge first epistemology, reliabilism, virtue epistemology. So, in what ways would the view you present in this book differ from those other views, and what would it basically add to the picture?
Yes. So the key idea of my book about epistemology is that we acquire in virtue of employing capacities. We are in a phenomenal state that is constituted by those capacities.
Yeah.
That provides us with phenomenal evidence, which is evidence that pretty much correlates one-to-one with our phenomenal states. I'm leaving out lots of details here. And in virtue of employing those capacities, we also represent our environment, and that correlates, and that yields fact of evidence. So in a nutshell, I mean, I sort of distinguish between two layers of content: a content type that's the same just a matter of which capacities are employed, and a token content that depends on the context in which those capacities are employed. And so the content type yields phenomenal evidence, the content token yields factive evidence, at least in the good case, in the case of perception. And so what that means is that perception and hallucination provide us with phenomenal evidence, but in perception we have additional, powerful factive evidence. And then I also argue that factive evidence is sufficient evidence for knowledge. And what that means is that when we perceive, we have knowledge, even if there might be all kinds of defeaters. So how does that? So I'm not going to explain the differences between these views. That would be add a lot of hours to this interview. But I'll just say,
which in a way would be interesting, but anyway, go ahead.
So one thing that's important to me, and in this respect, my view differs significantly from, well, obviously reliabilism, but also knowledge first epistemology and virtue epistemology, which is that perception is not a very reliable faculty. So we make lots of mistakes, but as I see it, it's good enough for perception. So my view in no way depends on perception being reliable. Rather, what it depends on is the idea that perceptual capacities have a certain function. Namely, they function to do what they do in perception, which is discriminate and single out particulars in the environment. And it's that primacy of the good case, or this function of the capacities, that yields the epistemic goodness that is why it is rational for us to heed the testimony of our senses. And in the good case, in the case of perception, the capacities fulfill their function by definition. And in that case, the link between the environment is ideal, and so it is obviously rational to heed the testimony of your senses. But even in the bad case, the case where we hallucinate, a phenomenal state is brought about by employing capacities that function to do what they do in the good case. Now, as it so happens, we're not in the good case, but the capacities are still employed, and due to that, with some additions that I'm not going to go into here, it's rational to heed the testimony of our senses. And so in contrast to the knowledge first view, I'm not sort of saying that knowledge is primary. I'm explaining knowledge in terms of employing capacities which yield factive evidence, which I think, or I have an argument for, is sufficient evidence for knowledge. So as I see it, saying that knowledge is primary would sort of put the cart before the horse. You need to sort of explain what it is about. I sort of have an underlying story that explains things. And, the view differs dramatically from reliabilism in that I in no way appeal to the reliability of capacities to explain why it's rational to heed the testimony of our senses. There's lots of similarities between my view and virtue epistemology. In some sense, I could think of the view as a sort of version of virtue epistemology. But my colleague Ernie Sosa, who I've just co-taught a seminar with, is one of the most influential virtue epistemologists, if not the most influential. And I don't pitch the view as a version of virtue epistemology, although you can think of it as one, because it's a little bit odd to think of the capacities that I'm talking about as virtues. So they're very low-level, mechanistic, if you like, capacities. So I think of the capacities as quite differently, or virtue epistemologists simply talk about virtues or competences, and my capacities would play the role of what they call virtues and competences. I think of them as quite differently than they think of virtues and competences, and for that reason, I have not sort of officially aligned myself to their project, but it's very much in the spirit of the project. So, so one big difference between my view and say Ernie Sosa's view is that I would want to say that the capacities are not sort of intrinsically normative. Now, you could say, well, just in virtue of there being a good case and a bad case, they are normative. And that's not completely wrong, but if you say that that's all it takes, that all it takes is for there to be, so to spell that out a bit, the idea would be that the function of the capacities can either be fulfilled or not fulfilled, and the idea would be, well, that in itself is a way of having a normative element. Mm-hmm. But if that's what one says, then there isn't nothing in the world that isn't normative. Hearts have the function to pump blood. That doesn't make hearts normative, And so, so there's a lot to be said here, and mm-hmm. There's, anyway, the short version is of the three views you mentioned. My view is, in very important ways, different from knowledge first epistemology, very different from reliabilism. Has a lot of affinities to virtue epistemology, but in the book I spell out many more subtle differences. One key difference is that my view is sort of non-normative.
Mm-hmm. So, at the very least, I think it's safe to say that you're not a skeptic, right?
Well, we're all skeptics to some extent. Depends about what you're skeptical about. I certainly do not worry that the world will cease to exist tomorrow.
Yeah, I was thinking perhaps more skeptic in the Humean sense, I guess.
Right. Well, you sort of wonder whether anyone is skeptic, because even the most radical skeptics, eat dinner and don't seem to think there's a purpose to doing that. But yes. I've never been driven by that particular worry, is the way I would put it. But skeptic. I've never been driven by answering the skeptic in my approach. Yeah.
Great. So let me mention the book again: The Unity of Perception, Content, Consciousness, Evidence. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Schellenberg, would you like to, apart from the book, tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, probably the easiest way is to go to my website, and I have links to most of my papers there.
Okay, great. So I'm adding your website to the description box then, and thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully somewhere in the future I might have another conversation with you.
It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I will look forward to listening to many of your podcasts, because it was really thrilling talking to you, and I'm impressed by your wealth of knowledge about these topics. I know that you interview researchers from many different fields, and I am very intrigued by this. So thank you for including me.
Thank you so much for the kind words. Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. Please do not forget to share the video, subscribe to the channel, and also leave a like. And if you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links in the description box of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Berger Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dan Bauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, Simon Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litske, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eichland, Dr. Bird, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Mau Maria, Paul Jorge Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Ruth Towell, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Pedro Bonilla, Ziegler, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Herringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, and Manuel Oliveira. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Dugny, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Giddy, Thomas Turnbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.